Hello, I'm Michael, and if you're here, it's because you're as attracted to fear as I am. There was something peculiar about Windmill Creek, a town in rural Kansas forgotten by modernity and the main routes. The city was surrounded by vast plains and wheat fields that undulated like a golden sea in the wind. With just over 200 inhabitants, Windmill Creek seemed like the ideal place for those seeking peace and solitude. But behind his calm facade, there were secrets that no one dared mention. The protagonist, Ethan Green, was a 35-year-old investigative journalist used to looking for stories in big cities. After a scandal involving a poorly investigated report that almost ruined his career, Ethan decided to isolate himself for a while. He saw Windmill Creek as a refuge to reorganize his life, staying at a distant friend's cottage. However, his innate curiosity led him to discover that Windmill Creek had a history of mysterious disappearances without plausible explanations or in-depth investigations. It all started with a mural in the community center. It was a collage of old photos and clippings from local newspapers that told the history of the city. But what caught Ethan's attention was a disturbing pattern. Entire families disappeared from time to time, always in early autumn. There were no signs of violence or planned escape, just empty houses, as if the occupants had evaporated. Ethan began asking questions around town, but the answers were evasive. Mrs. Maybell, the local librarian, looked uncomfortable when he asked about the old cases. Sheriff Carter, with his cold, calculating gaze, hinted that Ethan should focus on enjoying the calm of the town. Despite the short and hostile responses, Ethan felt something he couldn't ignore. Windmill Creek hid something much bigger than it seemed. One night, while exploring the old files in the library's basement, Ethan found a lost diary from one of the missing residents. The notes talked about strange lights in the sky and sounds coming from the forest south of the city. One page, scrawled urgently, read, "They come when no one is looking. Trust no one." That night, Ethan felt the weight of isolation for the first time. The feeling of being watched increased with each step taken through the city's deserted streets. The wind whispered in the alleys, and shadows seemed to move in the streetlights. What began as a peaceful retreat was quickly turning into something much darker. Ethan knew he needed to uncover the truth, but little did he know that the truth was closer and more dangerous than he imagined. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. The words from the diary echoed in his mind. Don't trust anyone. Determined to follow the leads, he spent hours reviewing newspaper clippings and old records. One thing became clear. All the disappearances were connected to the forest south of Windmill Creek, the same one mentioned in the diary found. The next day, he decided to explore the place. The forest was dense and shadowy, even in the sunlight. The air there felt colder, and the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of branches breaking under their own footsteps. Amidst the trees, he found an old, weathered cabin. Inside, signs of recent presence. A rusty lantern, marks on the floor, and on the wall, a strange symbol drawn with something that looked like charcoal. The discovery only increased his suspicions. Ethan took a photo of the symbol and returned to town, trying to find more information. During his investigations, he noticed subtle changes in the behavior of residents. They avoided crossing his path, whispered among themselves, and watched him from a distance, as if they knew he was approaching something forbidden. He later realized that some things in the city were no coincidence. The library, which once seemed like a haven of information, now seemed like a place of surveillance. In local archives, many pages were torn or stained, especially those that mentioned disappearances. Sheriff Carter, who had initially been cordial, now seemed to always be nearby, watching Ethan's every move. One night, while reviewing the files, Ethan found a hidden pattern. The symbol he saw in the cabin was not unique, appeared in some old city documents, often associated with the forest. It was something that the residents clearly did not want revealed. The tension increased. Over the next few nights, he began to realize that he was no longer alone. Footsteps were heard outside his house, and shadows moved in the windows. A nearby payphone rang insistently whenever he passed by, but there was no one on the line when he answered it. A local waitress, Grace, seemed to be the only one who didn't treat him with hostility. Ethan noticed that she was also avoided by the other residents, as if she carried the same burden of curiosity. Investigating further, he discovered that Grace had direct connections to the disappearances. Her older brother had disappeared years before, leaving behind notebooks full of unsettling notes about the city and its secrets. Together, they analyzed the notebooks and began to piece together the mystery. The writing spoke of an obscure group in the city, called only the Guardians of the South. These texts indicated that Windmill Creek was built on land considered sacred, and the forest to the south was the center of something inexplicable. With each discovery, the feeling of imminent danger grew. Ethan realized that the town's warnings and stares weren't just out of curiosity or contempt. They were warnings. Something or someone didn't want him to continue. That night, while he was reviewing his notes, a stone went through the window of his house, carrying a clear message written in irregular letters. Leave before it's too late. But the threat didn't stop him. On the contrary, Ethan felt he was closer to the truth than ever, even if it meant putting his own life at risk. Tensions at Windmill Creek reached a new height. Ethan felt that the residents were no longer hiding their distrust. At every corner, fixed eyes followed his steps. The small town, which had seemed welcoming upon his arrival, was now a maze of suffocating secrets. Guided by clues from the found diary and Grace's brother's notebooks, Ethan decided to return to the forest. This time, the atmosphere seemed even denser, as if the environment itself wanted to repel his presence. During the walk, he found something that would completely change the direction of his investigation. A circle of stones covered in moss, arranged in precise patterns and marked with the same symbol he had seen in the cabin. In the center of the circle, there was a buried object. Digging with his hands, Ethan found a wooden box that had deteriorated with age. Inside were documents dating back to the early 20th century, when Windmill Creek was founded. The faded pages spoke of pacts and sacrifices made by a group of pioneers to protect their lands against natural disasters and misfortune. The notes mentioned an entity described only as the Guardian. She demanded loyalty and payment in exchange for prosperity, and payment came in the form of periodic disappearances. Each generation, a select group of residents were tasked with keeping the pact alive, ensuring that the entity was satisfied. Back in town, Ethan realized that the disappearances were not accidents or coincidences. They were chosen. The Guardians of the South existed, and their influence was deeply embedded in the fabric of the city. The sheriff, Mrs. Maybell, and other residents were complicit, following orders to keep secrecy. That night, while reviewing documents in his home, Ethan heard footsteps outside. Bright flashlight lights danced through the windows. The sound of doors being forced open invaded the silence. Ethan knew they had come to get him. Escaping out the back door, he ran to Grace's house. Together, they decided to expose the truth. Ethan carried the documents and photos with him, while Grace carried her brother's notebooks. Combining information, they discovered that the next choice would be in less than 24 hours during a ceremony in the forest. The city appeared to be in an undeclared state of alert. Ethan and Grace hid in the barn of an abandoned property, but the feeling of being chased was suffocating. The sound of footsteps on the creaking wood, the rustle of leaves and the icy breeze that passed through the cracks in the barn created a scene of absolute terror. When night came, Ethan decided it was time to act. He and Grace headed into the forest, determined to stop whatever was planned. But as they approached the circle of stones, they realized they were not alone. Hooded figures surrounded the place, muttering in an ancient language. In the center, a bonfire cast unsettling shadows on the surrounding trees. The atmosphere became heavy, almost suffocating. Ethan realized the truth was even more terrifying than he imagined. The pact with the Guardian was not just a myth. Something really was there, watching, waiting. The scene before Ethan and Grace was surreal. The circle of stones, illuminated by the flames of the bonfire, seemed to pulse like a living entity. The hooded figures sang rhythmic and mesmerizing chants. The air was thick, as if charged with electricity, making it difficult to breathe. As they watched from the undergrowth, Ethan realized that the group in the circle was not just a collective of villagers devoted to obscure traditions. It was something deeper, more sinister. The chants reverberated, seeming to draw the forest towards them, as if the trees were leaning towards the ritual. Grace trembled beside him, but her gaze was fixed on the group. Ethan knew she struggled with the pain of losing her brother and anger at the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives. Despite her fear, she was determined to expose what was happening. Ethan and Grace needed proof. He adjusted his camera, recording everything silently, careful not to make any noise. As the ritual continued, the wind began to blow strongly, fanning the flames and sending sparks flying around. It was as if something invisible was manifesting itself. Suddenly, the chant stopped, and the silence was even more terrifying. A taller figure in a different robe approached the center of the circle. In her hands, she held a strange object, a small artifact made of bones and metal, decorated with symbols that Ethan recognized from the documents found. The artifact seemed to glow faintly, emitting a barely perceptible sound, a vibration that hit Ethan and Grace like a wave. It was at that moment that everything seemed to become clearer. The entire city was tied to a pact that was not just symbolic, but real. Ethan realized they couldn't stay hidden much longer. He gestured to Grace, indicating that they needed to get closer. They started to move carefully, but then the ground beneath their feet creaked. The sound echoed in the clearing, interrupting the ritualistic silence. The hooded figures turned towards the sound. Ethan's heart raced as he and Grace tried to retreat, but it was too late. Lanterns were lit, and they were spotted. The hooded men ran towards him. Ethan and Grace fled through the forest, avoiding trees and branches. The sound of footsteps followed them closely, and voices murmured something that sounded like a curse. Ethan knew that if they were captured, there would be no escape. During their escape, they found a trail that led to an old watchtower, a remnant of the city's past. They went upstairs quickly, locking the door behind them. From up there, they were able to observe the clearing from a new perspective. The group had returned to the circle, but something was different. At the center of the ritual, a figure began to form. She wasn't human. It was a dense shadow, which seemed to distort the light around it, growing in height and imposing an overwhelming presence. The artifact now glowed brightly, and the sound it emitted had turned into a low-pitched noise that made the ground vibrate. Grace looked at Ethan, and he knew she was one step away from giving in to fear. He, in turn, felt the same, but knew they couldn't give up. The ritual was close to reaching its climax, and if they didn't intervene, the city, or something much larger, would pay the price. Despite the terror, Ethan found the strength to formulate a plan. Using his camera's range and recorded footage, he sent the videos and documents to a trusted contact outside the city using his cell phone's weak signal. It was a risk, but it was the only way to guarantee that the information wouldn't be lost if they didn't make it out alive. Meanwhile, Grace found something unexpected in the tower, a hidden compartment containing an ancient map. The map showed details of the forest and marked a specific location beyond the ritual circle. Perhaps it was a sanctuary or an exit, something that could help them escape or end the ritual. With the map in hand, Ethan and Grace decided to take a chance. They needed to get down from the tower and infiltrate the clearing again, challenging not only the Guardians, but the entity itself that seemed to manifest itself. Ethan and Grace descended from the watchtower with a determination that overcame their fear. The surrounding forest seemed to be alive, pulsing with incomprehensible energy. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches, seemed amplified, as if the environment itself was conspiring against them. With the map in hand, they moved towards the marked point. It was a silent journey, full of tension, The ritualistic clearing continued to be active in the distance, and the presence of the entity made the air almost unbearable, as if something invisible was pressing down on their bodies. The location marked on the map led them to a rock formation covered in ivy. There, they discovered a hidden entrance, a narrow cave, which gave off a damp, ancient smell. Inside, the walls were covered in symbols similar to those Ethan had found in the stone circle. However, contrary to what they expected, the symbols here seemed contorted, as if they were trying to erase or distort their own meaning. At the bottom of the cave, they found a stone pedestal on which another artifact rested. This was similar to the one used by the Guardians in the ritual, but it seemed to be deactivated, unlit. Beside it, inscriptions carved into the stone told a story. The original pact was not just an agreement for prosperity, but a trap. The pioneers of Windmill Creek had invoked the Guardian without understanding his true nature. The entity, thirsty for control, demanded continuous sacrifices to maintain its influence over the city. However, the artifact present there had been created by someone who had tried to end the cycle. According to the inscriptions, activating it during the ritual could interrupt the entity's manifestation, but this would come at a terrible price. Ethan knew there was no alternative. He grabbed the artifact and, with Grace at his side, ran back to the clearing. When they arrived, the ritual was in full swing. The entity was now an imposing and grotesque figure, a colossal shadow that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. The Guardians, kneeling, murmured fervently, and the artifact they held in the center glowed with an unbearable intensity. Ethan and Grace moved quickly, using the darkness around them to get closer. When they were close enough, Ethan took the newly found artifact out of his pocket. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision. The inscriptions in the cave had made it clear. Using the artifact would not be a solution without consequences. With a burst of courage, he charged forward, throwing himself into the circle. The entity seemed to sense his presence, and an inhuman roar echoed through the forest. The shadow expanded, swallowing everything in oppressive darkness. Ethan activated the artifact. Immediately, a bright light emanated from him, contrasting with the darkness of the entity. The sound of the roar intensified, mixing with screams from the Guardians. The forest seemed to crumble around them, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Grace watched, unable to move, as Ethan was pulled into the center of the circle. Light and shadow collided in a terrifying spectacle, creating waves of energy that toppled trees and sent rocks flying. With one last scream, the entity dissipated, leaving only silence. The Guardians were lying around the circle, unconscious or dead. The artifact gave off one last glow before disintegrating in Ethan's hands. When Grace ran to the center, she found only emptiness. Ethan had disappeared, taken by the force that had destroyed the entity. The forest was now quiet, as if the pact had never existed, but the price had been too high. The silence that took over the forest was almost deafening. Grace stood in the center of the circle, her eyes fixed on the empty space where Ethan had been moments before. The clearing, once alive with the dark energy of the ritual, now seemed like a dead space, a stage of destruction and emptiness. The Guardians, scattered across the floor, did not move. Some were breathing weakly, others were completely still. The bonfire had gone out, and the only light came from the stars above, visible again after the entity dissipated. Grace felt an overwhelming mixture of relief and pain. Ethan had destroyed the pact, but at the cost of his own existence. She knew he understood the risk from the beginning, but that didn't lessen the emptiness that now consumed her. Gathering what was left of her courage, Grace searched through Ethan's pockets left behind and found the camera he had used to document everything. The device was still intact, with the recordings preserved. It was his only weapon to expose the truth about Windmill Creek and honor Ethan's sacrifice. Upon leaving the forest, Grace noticed that the city had changed. The lights in the houses were off, the streets were deserted. It was as if the residents themselves knew that something monumental had happened. She went home, where she spent the night reviewing the recordings and organizing the documents. The next day, Grace left Windmill Creek. She took with her the evidence of the pact and the ritual, determined to bring justice. She sent everything to investigative journalists and authorities outside the city. However, when he returned weeks later, he found something disturbing. Windmill Creek seemed more alive than ever. New buildings appeared and residents seemed to prosper. No one mentioned Ethan or the events in the forest. It was as if the city's collective memory had been erased. Grace tried to find traces of Ethan or anyone who remembered him, but it was as if he had never existed. Even the documents she had sent mysteriously disappeared, and the journalists who had received her messages no longer responded. The city seemed to continue to prosper, but Grace knew that the cycle was not truly over. The pact had been destroyed, but something new seemed to have taken its place, something even more sneaky. Years later, Grace, unable to forget or overcome the loss, returned to the forest. At the location of the stone circle, he found something he didn't expect, a new formation with recent marks. Among the stones was a small, familiar object, Ethan's watch. She understood then that Ethan was still connected to that place in some way. The Guardian may have been defeated, but the mystery of Windmill Creek lived on, growing in the shadows, waiting. The city, with its bucolic charm and smiling residents, hid something bigger than anyone could imagine. Grace left the watch at the center of the formation and departed, knowing that her fight against the mysteries of Windmill Creek was far from over.